Welcome. Thank you for joining the Nightingale School of Nursing here in London. If you look around, you will see the beginning of a new era for nursing. You are the very first students to be taught here. At the Nightingale School of Nursing, you will learn how to dress wounds, apply leeches, feed patients who are too weak to feed themselves, and learn Latin, among some other things. Remember, nursing is an art. It requires as exclusive a devotion and as hard a preparation as any painter's or sculptor's work. Here at the Nightingale School of Nursing, you are expected to keep a journal of all your work, which can be reviewed at any time. Please also keep a diary, understanding that I will inspect it once a month. Nursing used to be a disrespectful job. The nurses were drunk women. The most they could do for you was change your bandage. It seemed as if hospitals did not believe in being clean. Surgery was seen as a last resort. Nothing was cleaned. That was then. This is now. You will learn how to keep everything clean and how to take care of patients better than the people at home can do. Dusting nowadays means nothing more than flecking the dust from one room to another, with all doors and windows closed. If you want to remove the dust, you must wipe it with a damp cloth. Now that you know what is expected, I'm sure you are eager to hear my story. When I was 14, we lived at Embley Lee, our home near the southern coast of England. The whole household became sick with the flu during the Great Flu Epidemic in 1834. Only the cook and I didn't get sick. My sister, Parthe, didn't get sick either, but that was because she was with relatives over the holidays. I tended to the patients with hot and cold compresses and pain medicine. In a letter that I sent Parthe, I told her that I hadn't killed any patients, but I cured only a few. It was during this time that I discovered the reason I was born, nursing. Started researching it immediately. I even had to study in secret. I learned at Kaiserwerth, a small town in Germany. Although I went there without my parents' consent, I adored my time there. Before I had gone to Kaiserwerth, I hadn't even brushed my hair by myself. That was how rich we were. The skills that I learned at Kaiserwerth were very important to my time in Scutari, a section of Istanbul, Turkey, by the Black Sea. My friend, Sidney Herbert, was in the War Office during the Crimean War in 1854. He sent me a letter asking me to assemble a force of 40 nurses to go and help the British soldiers. I interviewed the nurses myself, not wanting them to be young enough that they would want to run away with the soldiers, but I also didn't want them to be too old, so that I'd have to take care of them. I was only able to find 38 suitable nurses. Most of them were nuns. We all eagerly boarded the boat that would take us to Scutari. On the journey, though, most of us were seasick. When we arrived in Scutari, we were ready to get to work. But Dr. John Hall, among others, did not want us there. They thought that we would be in the way, so they housed us in just 4 small bedrooms with absolutely no furniture. When I was finally able to go into the hospital, I was astonished at the mess. The soldiers were crammed in. Bloody rags covered the floor. Rats ran wild. Fleas and lice crawled over everything. I cut my hair short to keep it free of fleas and lice. Still, it took a couple more days before Dr. John Hall allowed us to help, and that was only when another wave of wounded soldiers arrived. I immediately set to work. I bought some scrub brushes and ordered some of the nurses and some of the less wounded soldiers to scrub the floor clean. I also ordered the soldiers' wives, who were living in the cellar of the hospital, to do the laundry by boiling the shirts in water, scrubbing them thoroughly, and hanging them up to dry. Before this, the laundry was shipped out to the locals, who only swished the shirts and things around in cold water. was cleaned and everything was in place. Even a cook came and professionally cooked the meals for the soldiers. Late at night, after all the other nurses had gone to bed, I stayed up and walked the halls, comforting the soldiers by night. I am told I walked a total of 4 miles every night. I also wrote letters to my family and the families of the soldiers. I also became known as the Lady with the Lamp, and although I disliked it, I became famous. Back in England, people were naming their daughters after me. They were even buying figures of me. In Scutari, I was pushing myself too hard. I even collapsed from cranial fever. The doctors wanted to send me back to England, but I refused. So they moved me to a small cottage away from the hospital where my dear Aunt Mai came to help nurse me back to health. Soon I was able to return to Scutari, where everything was running smoothly. At last, the Crimean War was over. I stayed for 5 more months, nursing the soldiers back to health. When it was time to head home, I had to use the name Miss Smith to get home without anybody recognizing me. Soon I was walking with an ivy-covered gate back home at Embley Lee. Mother and Parthay had taken it upon themselves to write letters to all my fans. They were upset with me when I went to Scutari, but when I came home, they were glad they were related to me. Queen Victoria herself invited me to her palace in 1854. While I was there, she gave me enough money to start this school here in St. Thomas's Hospital. It has taken me 4 years to start up this school. While you are here, you will get free room and board, free classes, and a salary. You are expected to do well in your classes. Before I send you off to your classes, do you have any final questions for me?
This reception for the Nobel Prize quite bores me. I'm guessing they probably want to know more about our discovery of artificial radioactivity. After all, people have been quite skeptical about my and Frederick's discovery. Since the beginning, when we discovered artificial radioactivity, we finally have gotten the chance to step out of the shadow of my parents, Marie and Pierre Curie. Just 2 years ago, we were at the Solvay conference in Belgium. It was 1933, and it was the first time we had been invited to the conference, and we were sure we had something to show. In the past, we had made a couple fatal mistakes. A year earlier, we had been much too eager to present some research on beryllium, a quite rare element that is in the same family as radium. We knew other scientists were working on the same issue, so we quickly theorized, although incorrectly, that the experiment had produced powerful gamma rays. We had actually produced proof that neutrons exist. And once again, something similar happened when we were doing experiments with neutrons and missed the discovery of the positron. So when we finished telling our findings at the Solvay conference, the other scientists questioned our results more than they would have if we had not messed up in previous times. Our research challenged the way scientists understood the atom, and so when we finished telling our findings, the room was quiet. Then Liz Mettner, a German scientist with a reputation, raised her hand. My colleagues and I have done similar experiments. We have been unable to uncover a single neutron. How do we misinterpret our results again? But we still continued to believe that we were correct, and our findings were accurate. We repeated our experiments again and again, each time making little changes to our approach. Everything finally made sense on January 11th, 1934, when we were doing experiments with a machine called a Wilson cloud chamber. It allows scientists to see what cannot be seen with the naked eye. We were using polonium and seeing the alpha particles it released. We placed a thin sheet of aluminum foil in between the polonium and the Wilson cloud chamber, and used a Geiger counter, which measures radioactivity, while slowly moving the polonium away from the aluminum foil. We had expected the Geiger counter to stop beeping when we moved the polonium farther away, but it kept beeping for a short time of 3.5 minutes. We were very excited. The aluminum had a short radioactive life. We had discovered artificial radioactivity. It was a great moment for us. It was our scientific breakthrough. I watched as Frederick jumped up and down through the halls of the Radium Institute. We had not misinterpreted the results. Not this time. We had 3 days to create a detailed report on what we had discovered. At that point, we invited my mother and Frederick's mentor to come and see the artificial radioactive aluminum. I will never forget the look on my mother's face when I handed her the first ever test tube of artificial radioactive aluminum. She held the tube in her radium-scarred fingers, understanding that we, as physicists, had made a revolutionary discovery in science. When I was 17, the Great War started, and I was on vacation with my sister Eve in La Acrouste in Ploubazin, France. The French had many casualties, and some injuries needed x-rays. Most hospitals did not have x-ray equipment, so Mother asked the military for permission to use cars and put x-ray equipment in them for driving on the front lines. Mother got people to donate money for their cars and their personal cars to use. The cars were painted gray with a bright red cross symbol to identify them as X-ray ambulances. Now a common sight at the battlefield, the soldiers nicknamed the cars Les Petites Crises in honor of my mother. Through many letters, I begged my mother to let me come to Paris and join the fight. She finally relented and let me become an X-ray technician. I started in my mother's Car E, and we visited many temporary hospitals and helped many patients. It was common for us to come across older doctors who did not believe in the power of X-rays. I eventually moved into a different car than my mother's. One time, I X-rayed a man who had an injury in his upper thigh, and the doctor, who did not think much of X-rays, tried to enter the open wound to get the shrapnel out by going through the open wound. I tried to give him a suggestion of where to enter the wound, but he would not listen. He entered the open wound, searched, and found nothing, but then tried my suggestion and quickly extracted the shrapnel. Another time, a military officer told me that my equipment could not be unloaded for 3 days. So I convinced a medical student and one man to help me unload my supplies, and we had it done before lunch, and I was already operating that same day. By the time I was in my 20s, the world knew my mother's name. In 1920, an American reporter named Mary Missy Maloney asked my mother for an interview, which she usually said no to. But Melanie said, "You have been important to me for 20 years, and I want to see you for a few minutes." Something about that request, something which I do not understand, struck as reasonable to my mother. Mother told me later that she had mentioned to Ms. Maloney that she wanted another gram of radium for the Radium Institute. At that time, there's only 1 gram, 1 little gram, of radium in the possession of my mother, and only 140 grams worldwide. 1 gram of radium cost about $150,000. Ms. Maloney launched a campaign for women in the United States to buy a gram of radium for Marie Curie. Part of the fundraiser was that Mother, Eve, and I would tour the United States, and Mother would talk about her work. In May 1921, we arrived in New York and were greeted by thousands of fans. Mother and I were terrified of the attention. Eve always wore fancy silk stockings and fashionable dresses, while Mother and I dressed more practically. On our trip, Mother accepted more than 20 honorary degrees from various colleges and universities. Many times, Eve or I would pretend to be Mother, and I accepted many of her honorary degrees. We did this because Mother often did not feel well throughout our 6-week tour. Because of her work with radioactive material, she had tinnitus, or constant humming in the ears, and cloudy vision. I took over many of the more scientific talks, for I am a physicist myself, while Eve took the times when Mother did not have to talk about her work. The grand finale of this tour was that President Warren G. Harding would present my mother the gram of radium at a big ceremony at the White House in a mahogany lead-lined box. Really, that fancy box was empty, because it would have been very dangerous to have so many people who could stand up and steal the radium. Instead, it was going to be shipped to the new French cruise liner, Paris. All those speeches and travel were well worth that gram of radium. In 1925, at the Sorbonne's amphitheater, over 1,000 people gathered to hear my doctoral thesis, which was titled Research on the Alpha Rays of Polonium. Polonium is, of course, the element my mother discovered and named after her beloved home country of Poland. I dedicated my thesis to Madame Curie by her daughter and pupil. Noticeably, Mother was not there because she knew that if she came, she would get more of the attention. Mother had arranged a tea and champagne party in the Radium Institute's gardens in honor of my success, to which the entire staff of the Institute was invited. Developing trays from the photographic darkroom were filled with cookies, and lab beakers were used as teacups. That, in my opinion, is a very odd way to use lab equipment, but I did enjoy the little party. Ah, here comes King Gustav V, the Fifth, of Sweden. He must be looking for me. Before I go, do you have any questions for me?
Well, if you must know, I am leaving Hollywood life to live in Aspen. Oh, I love Aspen. It reminds me so much of my home in Vienna, Austria. My name is Hedy Lamarr, and I'm so happy to be here, dreaming of my ski resort. I designed it like one of the ski resorts near my home in the Alps. I love to ski. I learned when I was a little girl. As a little girl living in Vienna, I had a wealthy family and went to a private school. My mother and father were both respectable people. I loved my father very much. He taught me all about mechanics. I used to love to take apart my music box and then reassemble it to see how it worked. As I grew older, I was less seen for my brains, but for my beauty. My face has always been my misfortune, a mask that I cannot take off. I must live with it, and I often curse it. When I was 16, in 1930, producer Max Reinhardt gave me a small role in the German production Gilde der Straße, or in English, Money on the Street. Next, I starred in the film Ecstasy. This film stirred up a lot of emotion. After this film, I was recognized by many wealthy Austrian men and their wives. Fritz Maldi saw me in the play Sissy and wanted to marry me. We were married in 1933. The wedding ceremony lasted about an hour. The marriage took that long too. I was more like a trophy than his wife. At one of his dinner parties, I realized that Maldi and his friends were Nazis. I needed to escape him. So one night, I put a sleeping powder into the maid's drink. When she was asleep, I got into the maid's clothes, sewed some jewels on the inside of the pockets, took the key to the door, got on my bike, and pedaled away. I made it to London, where I saw a film with a lion roaring in the beginning. That is when I decided I needed to go to Hollywood. I was introduced to the little man who owned Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer Studios. He offered me a contract for $100 a week. I said that I deserved more and left. But later, on the ship to America, I saw the little man again and decided that I needed to be seen. I put on my best clothes and finest jewels and walked right past his table. His eyes were fixed on me, and I then signed a contract for $600 a week. Later the next day, Mrs. Mayer thought that I should change my name to Hedy Lamarr. She thought it would be a good way to step out from the shadow that ecstasy had cast over me. When we made it to Hollywood, I was cast in a few small films, including Algiers. I was typecast into playing a European mystery woman who quite often did not have very much to say. My fame led me to many interesting people, like pilot Howard Hughes. I dated Howard for a while. He was such a bore. I was interested in his inventions. He told me he wanted to build the fastest planes in the world and give them to the U.S. military. I bought a book on fish and a book on birds. I found the fastest of each, combined them together, and got the idea for swept plane wings. When I gave the idea to Howard, he said to me, "Hedy, you're a genius." Helping people comes naturally to me, so I wanted to help people more. I tried to make a cube that dissolved in water and made a drink much like Coca-Cola, but I forgot that minerals in water in different places was not the same. Sometimes the cube dissolved at the top of the glass, other times in the middle, and quite often at the bottom. My most favorite invention came during World War II. My mother wanted to come to America, but passage across the Atlantic was dangerous. The German U-boats had been destroying tons of ships, so I had to figure out a way to make sure my mother crossed safely. In 1940, I met George Antheil at a dinner party. George was much like me. He had a quirky mind, an inventive mind. I told George how I wanted to do something about the war. I said that I was not comfortable sitting in Hollywood making money when things were in such a state. Together, George and I came up with the idea of frequency hopping. It was a system that took radio waves, and instead of keeping them in one frequency, it split them up and changed their frequencies. That way, if the Nazis jammed one of the signals, the command would still get through to the torpedo. We got a patent for the United States government in 1941 and waited to see if the Navy would use our idea. In 1942, the Navy rejected our idea. They basically told me I would help them more selling war bonds. So I sold war bonds, $25 million worth. I went to nightclubs and entertained soldiers. Although I was not yet an American citizen, I stood there representing America. On top of all of this, I was in a third-rate film called White Cargo. I hated filming it. This got me in trouble with the little man. By 1947, I was so annoyed with MGM that I left and co-produced my own movie, Dishonored Lady. This was very unusual at the time. The men in Hollywood made sure my success from this film was short-lived. Through 1948, my career took a bad turn. Then I met Mr. DeMille. He wanted me to star in his next religious epic, Samson and Delilah. This film was a huge success. It was my best movie. But after this, I was only in a few small films through 1958. In 1953, I became an American citizen, and I married W. Howard Lee. We moved to Texas, where I again became a trophy wife. It was only when we went to Aspen that I felt very happy. I must be going soon. so you better ask me any questions before my car gets here.
It was never my stated intention to break the gender barrier for my sport, but that's what happened when I became the first female to ride on the Olympic equestrian team. Some even say I earned the trifecta of making Olympian history. For along with being the first female to ride in the Olympics, I was also the first female to medal and the first Olympian to medal despite having a major physical disability. My life's career has given me some status, earning me the names hero to horse lovers, hero to women, and the hero to horse therapy advocates. I was born on March 14th, 1921, just a normal, horse-loving girl who liked to go on rides with her sister, our mother, of course, carefully watching us. My riding experience didn't begin until I started riding dressage, though I eventually moved into jumpers, in my late teen years, of course. Dressage is basically dancing with horses. Your movements are subtle, and it's to appear the horse is doing all the work, whereas jumpers is fast, adrenaline, and you're supposed to get through a course of jumps without any time faults. Every athlete faces obstacles. You can't imagine the elitism that followed the Olympic equestrian events when dressage became an official event in 1912, though the competition was only open to commissioned military officers. It would take another 40 years for civilians, both men and women, to be able to compete. So at the Helsinki Games in 1952, I remember that 4 other women, including myself, were able to compete. And ever since then, the Olympics have been subject to girl power. Some athletes face other obstacles. Mine occurred in 1944 when I was suddenly struck with the polio epidemic. It all happened so quickly. I was 23 and pregnant at the time. Poliomyelitis is a virus that affects the spinal cord of those who contract this deadly disease. In less than a few days, I was completely paralyzed. Though I was stubborn, determined, and more than my fair share of willpower, so it didn't matter that I was pregnant. A few months later, when my healthy baby girl was born, I began intensive physical therapy, and within a few months, I had regained control of my arms. Can you imagine a new mother and being 23 and not being able to move your arms? With fortitude, I eventually learned to crawl and then to walk with the help of crutches. And by the end of my rehabilitation, I had gained partial movement of my legs. It would take another 3 or so years for me to get back to high-level dressage. So when I entered the Scandinavian Riding Championships, I placed second. My paralysis, of course, remained, and it made it very difficult to get on and off my horses. So, with the help of my lovely husband, he helped me get on and off more times than I care to admit. My partner in rehab was an Oldenburg thoroughbred cross mare that had been in our family, Jubilee. She was so patient with us. You should have seen us those first few months. I was falling off Jubilee at a walk since I didn't have control of my legs. You have to understand that with dressage, you have subtle movements of your hands and legs. With improvement and practice, I returned to the Scandinavian Championships in 1947, and no one in competing at the international level even knew I was paralyzed. With my scores, I technically could have gone to the 1948 Olympics, but women were not yet allowed to compete. My arch nemesis and greatest competitor was a man from Sweden, Henri Saint Cyr. Henri, being the gentleman he is, helped me off my horse at the Helsinki Games, if I'm correct. There was not a dry eye when he did so, considering nobody even knew that I was paralyzed. I returned to the Olympic Games 4 years later in 1956. The Games were held in Stockholm, Sweden, where I again won silver. Denmark called me their national treasure, and I was inducted into several halls of fame. I had the honor of being a 7-time Danish champion as well. However, looking back, I'd have to say my greatest achievement was opening the first therapeutic riding center in Europe. Now, It's called hippotherapy, and there are facilities all over the world, helping people regain their balance and their control. It brings me great joy to look back, for even today, I can see that the Olympic spirit is still guiding me. Oh, I have to bring the horses back in from turnout. Before I go, do you have any questions?
Welcome, everyone. I've been looking forward to this meeting for a long time. It's not every day I get a chance to speak to a group of kids and teachers like yourselves. I've been thinking I was going to speak about the books I've written and the awards they've won, but anyone can discover that for themselves. Today, I want to give you a more personal glimpse of my life and of the story of the animals who inspired the stories I've written. My first book was called Voltes the Red Fox. It was based off some stories a friend used to tell me about a fox who liked to be chased. As I started writing my story, can you believe it? Someone actually gave me a little fox pup to nurse back to health. She was very sweet and often curled around my shoulders as I was writing my stories. She kept me company while my husband was off fighting in World War II. I wrote and published that book in 1948, and I haven't stopped writing since. My most popular book is called My Side of the Mountain. In the story, a young boy, Sam Gridley, decides he wants to try living off the land. He learns to boil water in leaves and make rabbit snares. He also learns to train a peregrine falcon, which hunts for him. Many people have written to tell me how much they've enjoyed my stories, including some of you. I'm so glad you've enjoyed it. I must say, though, it only took me 2 weeks to write. It was basically the story of my own life. When I was in elementary school, I packed my bag and told my mother I was going to run away from home. As I envisioned it, I would live by a waterfall in the woods and catch fish on the hooks made from the forks of tree limbs, as I had been taught by my father. Wisely, my mother did not try to dissuade me. She had done the exact same thing when she was my age, as I found out later. She simply checked my bag for a toothbrush and a postcard to let her know how I was getting along, and kissed me goodbye. 40 minutes later, I was back home. When my daughter, Twig, was in elementary school, she told me she was going to run away to the woods. I simply checked her bag for her toothbrush and watched her go down the front steps, her shoulders squared confidently. I blew her a kiss and sat down to wait. Presently, she was back. Although wishing to run to the woods and live on our own seems to be an inherited characteristic in our family, we are not unique. Haven't you ever dreamed at some time of running away to a distant mountain or island? Or maybe a castle or a sailing ship? Haven't you ever wanted to run away to some faraway place to live there in beauty and peace? Even in my adult life, I've often wished to run away. While realistically, I could not, I decided to write about someone who could. I must say, I think that writing or reading about someone running away is easier and just as fun as doing it for yourself. As I said, most of the things Sam did in the story were things I learned to do growing up. Even Frightful, Sam's falcon, was based on my own falconry experience. My brothers were some of the first falconers in the United States, and one day they decided to give me a bird of my own. When they sat him in my hands, he immediately sunk his claws into my skin and bit me. I said, "Ouch, that hurts! You're a bad boy." Well, the name stuck, and he was called Bad Boy from then on. He was a little kestrel, one of the smallest hawks used for falconry. My brothers taught me to train him in the traditional method of a true falconer, and he was my companion for several years. Throughout my life, I've had many pets that came from the wild. I treated them just like you would treat a dog or a cat. I didn't realize it was anything out of the ordinary until my first day in kindergarten. Imagine my surprise when I found I was the only kid with a vulture as a pet. His name was Nod, and I loved him dearly. He was a wonderful first pet. Sadly, I didn't get to keep him long. Eventually, Nod grew up, and my mother didn't like how he stared at her while she was making dinner. My father arranged for him to go to a zoo in Scotland. I imagine he lived a very happy life there. Many of my favorite memories as a kid were made at our summer home, the Craigheads, a large Victorian-style house in the woods of Pennsylvania. It was my father's boyhood home, and oftentimes my aunts and uncles and cousins would come to live there too. It was such a beautiful place. When our chores were done, we would run outside barefoot to fish, swim, canoe, or anything else we fancied. It was also where my brothers learned falconry. During the summer, the backyard was full of trained hawks, owls, and falcons. I've always loved birds. They often seem to make some of our most interesting pets. I've had many crows throughout the years, but two of my favorites were named New York and Crowbar. I adopted New York because I was curious if crows could learn to speak. I made a point of saying hello to him every morning, but for months he just sat there, quiet as a mouse. But one day, our milkman burst in. He stared at me and shook his head in relief. "I thought you were up in the maple tree," he said. "I was sure I heard you say hello to me from the branches." "It's the crow," I cried. From then on, New York loved to greet us. But one day, I overheard our neighbors talking about how a big black bird had landed on their picnic table and said, "Hiya, babe." Well, apparently that was too much. They ran into their houses and closed their doors. The bird then proceeded to eat all it wanted of their hamburgers, strawberry shortcake, cheese, and nuts. Well, they didn't realize New York was a pet. He was a very clever but very naughty bird. I suppose I could go on and on about all the wonderful wild animals I've known. Perhaps another time I'll tell you about the owl in my shower, the tarantula in my purse, or the turtle who fell down the stairs. You know, lately I've really found myself fascinated by the alphas in a species. I recently read an article about the social structure of Japanese monkeys, and about how some monkeys in every group were leaders called alphas. I hope to study alphas closer than Japan, however. Wolves, perhaps? I must speak to my editor about this, but before I go, do you have any questions for me?